Often say they save the best for last, and we have certainly done so on the Steve Malzberg Show tonight. We are honored to welcome our final guest of the 3 hours, Dr. Tevi Troy. Dr. Tevi Troy has a PhD in American Civilization from the University of Texas at Austin, and he has served his country with honor and distinction, first serving as the Deputy Assistant to the President of the United States, George W. Bush, for domestic policy, as the President's Domestic Policy Advisor, and then most recently serving as the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. Dr. Troy has an amazing new book out. It comes out next week. I'm honored to actually have a copy in my hand now that is intriguing. It's called What Jefferson Read, Ike Watched, and Obama Tweeted, 200 Years of Popular Culture in the White House. Dr. Tevi Troy, one of my dearest friends, thank you for joining us here on the Steve Malzberg Show.
Thanks for having me, Ron. And like Steve Malzberg, I will also be celebrating Rosh Hashanah soon, but I'm glad to get this interview in before the holiday starts.
You know, I was going to say that, and I thought I won't even go there, but you beat me to it. Tevi, what you don't know is that we are so pleased to have you here. I'm going to hold you for two segments. The first segment, we're going to start off talking a little bit about healthcare, and then going into your book, and then having the second segment also devoted to talking about your new book and what Americans can learn about their presidents, past and present, as we look at popular culture. Just a few moments ago, we had Sally Pipes on, who I know you know well, talking about Obamacare. And from your perspective as the Deputy Secretary, former of the Department of Health and Human Services, has Obamacare given the department, have they really cut off more than they can chew? And what do you see with the exchanges opening on October 1st and heading into full implementation on January 1? What do you see is likely to happen over the next 6 months?
Yeah, well, it's clearly too much for any department to handle just in terms of the regulatory load that needs to happen. And we've seen a lot of missed deadlines. We've seen a lot of delays announced. But those kinds of things happen with ordinary legislation. The Obama legislation, I would say, is extraordinary because even if they get all the implementation done, it's not designed in a way that it'll actually work. So they're dealing with a lot of work that they have to do, and there's something like over 15,000 pages of regulations on top of a 2,700-page bill. But they're also dealing with a law that just misunderstands incentives and won't actually get done what they needed to get done.
And you talk about incentives, or I should say lack thereof, and I think a lot of Americans enjoy the traditional 40-hour work week and don't recognize that under Obamacare there will be an incentive for employers to drop employee coverage so that they can get under a 30-hour cap. Do you think that we're going to have millions of people losing coverage, or is this something that's been overblown in the conservative media of saying, oh, there's no way we're going to lose 2, 3, 4 million people of having their coverage dropped?
Oh, not at all overblown. I think this is a serious issue. We're already seeing when employers are hiring, they're hiring people for 30-hour weeks or less so that they don't have to do the 40 hours. It's not because the employers are mean or cruel. It's because these are the incentives that the government sets up. And employers read the law. They want to follow the law. And it says, if I hire a person for these X number of hours, then I either have to pay for very expensive health insurance because it's more expensive under Obamacare, or I have to pay a fine to the government. And it makes sense that employers don't want to do either of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that worries me, Tevi, is you and I both look at health policy. I'm worried about the invincibles, those so-called young people ages 18 to 30, 32, who are going to take a look at the individual mandate provisions and say, you know what, I can pay a fine of $95 and opt out of Obamacare, or I can go forward and elect to get coverage, and it might cost me several $1,000s that I don't have. If you have these invincibles out of the population, is there any way that the older, sicker people who will be in Obamacare, won't the system crush under its own weight of really being more expensive than we were led to believe that it would be?
Well, it'll definitely get more expensive, and I agree with you how the young invincibles are going to react. I think the older, sicker people will, to some degree, have an advantage because the rates are mandated at a relatively lower level for them, given the services they require. But the people that really, I think, are going to get squeezed on both ends are the people like you and me. We don't consider ourselves young invincibles. We're both married. We will purchase health insurance, but it's going to be more expensive. We're also not eligible for the subsidies, so we're going to be paying more in taxes to cover the cost of this whole thing. So I think folks like you and me get the double squeeze.
I think that's right. And frankly, I don't see any way out of this, Tevi, other than repealing the bill. I mean, you've heard supporters of the president say that opposition to Obamacare is rooted in racism, or once this plan is up and running, people are going to like it. But do you see any silver lining in the Obamacare legislation that's about to become law next year? Is there anything that we can look forward to, or is it as daunting as experts like you and Sally Pipes seem to believe that it is?
Well, it is pretty bad, and I, too, am a fan of full repeal. But I also recognize that there's no way we're going to get repealed while Obama is in the White House. So we need to think about smart alternatives. Sally Pipes is one of those people who talks about alternatives. I also think Republicans need to start looking to 2017, when the costs of the law are so manifest that it won't be possible for anyone to deny the high costs. Obama will be out of office. Even if it's another Democrat in office, they won't be as invested in the law. And I think that moment in 2017 could be the moment when we say, okay, let's come together again and come up with a better plan.
I think that's exactly right, and that's exactly why it's so important, not only in the midterm election for folks to go out and elect conservatives to office, but to really make sure in 2016 that we have a conservative president along with a conservative Congress that can put the brakes on this really devastating piece of legislation that's about to take full force of law in January. Now, Tevi, that's enough health care, my friend. It's time for us to have a little fun. I am so thrilled and so proud of you with this publication of your most recent book. This is your second book, and again, it's called, and I'll hold it up on the screen for those watching at home, What Jefferson Read, Ike Watched, and Obama Tweeted, 200 Years of Popular Culture in the White House. Now, I have to say, I dug right into this as soon as I got my hands on it, and I was surprised to learn that President Kennedy didn't like watching movies, and yet you go from President Kennedy to President Obama, who he likes to sort of compare himself to, that President Obama loves watching SportsCenter for a couple hours a night. What were some of the most revealing and interesting things that you found that you've put in the book for us?
Yeah, I think you touched on two right there. One is that Kennedy watched a lot less than people think he did. They think of him as associated with Hollywood glamour. But the truth is he was kind of an impatient fellow, and he didn't really like to sit and watch movies. And so occasionally he did, and there are some instances of that happening. But for the most part, he was too impatient. He liked interacting with people. I say in the book a little jibe. I say that he liked movie starlets more than he liked the actual movies that they appeared in.
There is that.
Kennedy, that's Kennedy. He kind of didn't watch as much as you think. Obama watches more than you think. He not only loves SportsCenter, but he's loved The Wire. He loves Homeland. He was briefed about a possible sleeper cell and recently, and he said, "Oh, just like Homeland." So he's kind of got it on the brain. He likes Mad Men, which reminds him of his grandparents. He's watched Modern Family with Michelle and the girls, which I'm not sure these girls should be watching, but yeah, he's a big fan of TV and continues to watch it.
Well, tell us, what's the big takeaway from your book? I mean, I think it's fascinating that you have had a 200-year swath of popular culture of what really motivated our presidents, what they did in their downtime. So much of their public life is on display, particularly in the 20th century and 21st century. But what struck you by some of our earlier presidents, those who perhaps were in office before the television age? What did you find revealing about what they were up to?
Yeah, well, there's two questions in there. One is, what is the big takeaway? The big takeaway is now that presidents have a lot more options thanks to technology for what they choose to do for education and for entertainment, but I'm not sure they're necessarily making better selections from among that greater panoply of choices. In terms of our earlier presidents, you had people like Adams and Jefferson who were among the best-read people in the entire colonies. Now, say what you like about our recent presidents, no one is going to call them the best-read people in the whole country because they have day jobs. But these guys really read. They took the ideas that they got from reading the Roman classics and from European Enlightenment philosophers, and they applied it to making the rationale for breaking away from England. And then they also applied it to developing the ideas that led to the Constitution. I have in there the story of James Madison asking Jefferson for advice on what books he should read leading up to the Constitutional Convention, and Jefferson sending him 2 crates of books about philosophy and about history that helped lead to his thinking on the Constitutional Convention. You've got to remember, this is a time when books were really expensive. A copy of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776, a first edition, cost about what an iPad would cost us today, and an iPad could hold about 80,000 books in it.
That's incredible. I didn't know that. And you recognize, of course, as you pointed out, that back then not only are they so expensive, but it was cumbersome to get them around, and nowadays you can just download, you can go to your provider of choice, zap it on your PDA of choice, and away you go. But I want you to touch on something that you and I both know from having had the privilege and the honor to serve in the Bush White House. So many people said, oh, President Bush, he doesn't read, you know, he's not intellectual. And would you tell us, what really was President Bush doing? Did he read? Was he reading books? What was the story about that?
Yeah, well, I argue in the book that Bush's reading was mischaracterized in two ways. First, in the 2000 campaign, you had, and I think this is journalistic malpractice, journalists who actually said he's a graduate of Harvard and Yale who doesn't read books. Mm-hmm. Now, that is a factual assertion that you can actually check, and these journalists didn't check that. They just assumed he doesn't read books. Well, Karl Rove said that in the 35 years he knows President Bush, he's never seen him without a book nearby, so he is a big reader. Then once he was in the White House, he had a reading contest with Karl Rove. They would read 80 to 90 books a year, and serious books. And then everybody knew that he was a reader, and you couldn't really deny it at that point. But then you would have kind of liberal elites talking about his reading in a dismissive way, saying, well, he reads a narrow list of books, or he reads books that tend to validate his perspective. Well, I'll tell you this. George W. Bush was much more likely to read a book by a liberal author than either Clinton or Obama would ever be to read a book by a conservative author. That's
interesting. Now, take it, you look at President George W. Bush, and obviously we both know that not only was he a avid reader, but Karl Rove had a Man in the Arena lecture series where he brought in prominent authors to discuss presidential leadership in the aftermath of 9/11. But take it all the way back from 2001 of the Bush presidency to 1901, and of course Teddy Roosevelt. Did Teddy Roosevelt have the same love and joy of reading books that our 43rd president did?
Even more so. He was one of our most eager readers ever, even from when he was a young child. He kind of had a hunger for books, a need for books. He was addicted to them. And when he was in the White House, if someone was boring him and not really keeping his interest, he was apt to take out a book and start reading in front of them. He would read 2 to 3 books a day while he was serving as president.
Hard to believe with the amount of pressures that are on a president that he was able to do it, but of course those were different times of where we were in 1901 versus where we were in 2001 after the attack on America on 9/11. Now, I can love to have you hang on for a little bit of the second block. Can we hold you over a little bit?
Absolutely.
Excellent. We're speaking to Dr. Tevi Troy, who has an amazing new book out, What Jefferson Read, Ike Watched, and Obama Tweeted, 200 Years of Popular Culture in the White House. This is Ron Christie sitting in for Steve Malzberg. We'll be back with more with Dr. Troy right after this. Stick with us.